Welcome. My name is Brian Shane. I'm the Associate Director for Academic Affairs and Faculty at the Chase Center. Thank you for all the panelists and for those of you who came here. It was exciting. The last panel, we gave an award for an essay, and it was won by an engineer who wrote about citizenship. So proof that this can happen in the same person. It's my pleasure to introduce the topic of this session, which is on the challenges that higher education faces, and we've got two excellent contributors for that who are well known both for their academic accolades as well as for their engagement with the public. The first is, I'm proud to say, my colleague, Michael Clune at the Chase Center, who previous to that was the Samuel B. and Virginia C. Knight Professor of Humanities at Case Western, and has written two, many books, but two of the most influential ones are Defense of Judgment, and then this past year, his novel, Pan, which has racked up lots of accolades in the press, and he writes regularly for various public-facing organizations. Second is Hollis Robbins, who is a professor of English at the University of Utah, where she previously was the Dean of Humanities, also a Dean at Sonoma State prior to that, and then prior to that, the Director of Africana Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Many of you may be familiar with her Substack and many other public writings on the topics of this conference. So please join me in welcoming them then. Each one will speak for 10 to 15 minutes. They'll have a chance to respond, and then we'll turn it over to you all.
Thank you. Is this on? You can hear me? Oh, cool. I want to thank Jeremy and everyone who's worked to put together this great event, and I'm glad to be here. I've already learned a lot. I'm looking forward to more. Jeremy had asked us, Hollis and I, to think about academia's greatest challenges, and so I took the opportunity to think broadly about that. The main problem that confronts higher education today is the porousness of its border with the surrounding culture. This will sound odd, especially in the context of decades of steadily increasing calls to make the walls of the ivory tower more permeable. Yet I believe that it is no accident that as universities have grown ever more like the community they serve, public trust in universities has plummeted to historic lows. Very few people believe the ambient culture in 2026 is a healthy one. In fact, as I've been going around the country in the last few weeks, I've asked people this: do you think our culture is in any way healthy? I've yet to hear one positive response. One might cite numerous metrics in support of this intuition, from historically high rates of mental illness, suicide, overdose deaths, and income inequality, to disturbingly low levels of civic and community engagement, literacy, and childbirths. Despite our prostration to the ideals of progress and innovation, studies of patent applications and scientific papers show that technical innovation has been declining for decades, while an emerging consensus recognizes our popular and artistic cultures are drained of originality and power. In this context, higher education can best serve society by being different from it. We should cultivate traditional academic values, practices, and methods in order to endow students with the resources to become the kinds of citizens, thinkers, and creators that their world needs. I do not imagine that mass higher education has ever been or will ever be conducted in a sublime indifference to the society that supports it. My argument is rather that the goods society most needs from education pragmatically require relative isolation from prevailing social conditions. Paradoxically, in order to preserve the social value of education, we must rebuild the thick walls that separate academia from its host society. I want to briefly illustrate my thesis with 3 examples of how higher education in recent decades has knocked holes in those walls. In each case, we will see that academic community engagement has failed both academia and the community. Before proceeding, I should say that I don't believe the proper relation between the university and society can be determined in an ahistorical manner. In some periods, the distance of higher ed from the wider world breeds alienation, traditional canons and methods become stifling and moribund, and require revivification from outside, but this is not our case today. The first example of malign porousness is the conceptualization of higher education in the narrow terms of job preparation. For centuries, educators have made the point that narrowly vocational training deprives students of the riches of a liberal education and its promise to free the mind and make the person fit for citizenship in a republic. Chad Wellman, in his forthcoming book, makes this argument in a particularly forceful and subtle way. Yet over the past several years, we've seen this commitment to workforce development fail on its own terms. Universities, informed by job market trends, promised students that degrees in computer science or marketing would lead to solid jobs, and yet now we find that computer science majors have a significantly higher unemployment rate than art history majors. The emerging impact of generative AI on labor conditions illustrates a basic principle. Universities are not good judges of what the job market will look like in 4, 8, or 20 years. Conversely, as I and others have argued, the skills fostered by the traditional study of the liberal arts endow students with precisely those capacities, such as judgment, human communication, and synthetic and critical intelligence, that organizations are beginning to prioritize at the expense of vocational skills. I can imagine an array of alternatives that preserve the boundary that shelters the habits of slow reading and reflective judgment. University education can provide students the capacities that can't be cultivated on the job, while companies can reinvest in on-the-job training needed to apply these capacities to the particular needs of the organization. And I was just invited to talk to a group of business people, and this is their number one kind of question, which is they're reimagining something that they haven't done for a long time in really reinvesting really rethinking the relationship between academia and entry-level jobs. And this, AI is the major background to this. Or we might move to a 3-year model of coursework with the final year devoted to projects incorporating various field-specific technologies or experiences. The point is to resist the temptation to collapse the boundaries separating work and education. The second example of porousness is the reconceptualization of academic teaching and research in terms of partisan political activism. This transformation cannot be understood outside the context of institutional demands for immediate public impact and relevance. Faculty, especially in the humanities and social sciences, responded to these demands by reformulating their work in terms of direct interventions in matters of contemporary political controversy. Because the number one reason poll respondents give for the lack of trust in universities is the politicization of higher education, this issue has gotten a great deal of attention over the past 2 to 3 years. Academics' efforts to serve progressive political causes fails on its own terms for 2 reasons. First, the field-specific expertise of faculty does not place them in a position of authority in matters of political judgment, which, in a democracy, is the equal responsibility of all citizens. Students have good reasons for respecting and deferring to my literary judgment, or at least I would argue, but 0 reasons for deferring to my political opinions. Thus, the reframing of faculty expertise in terms of partisan politics undermines the true basis of faculty authority. Second, the overwhelmingly left character of faculty's political views ensures that roughly half of a politically divided nation will view activist faculty as political enemies, an unsustainable situation, obviously for public universities, but as Steve Mintz pointed out, also for private universities such as Columbia, Johns Hopkins, who get a lot of their income from public grants. Universities have knocked a 3rd hole in their walls to accommodate technology. Universities, driven by the culture's enthusiasm for all forms of technological novelty, have been among the first and most enthusiastic adopters of any new gadget. In 2026, we are in a position to understand how the introduction of technology into educational settings over the past quarter century has produced a wide range of measurable negative effects on student learning and mental health. As Michael Bloomberg, who's hardly a Luddite, summarizes these findings, all the promised academic benefits of laptops in schools never materialized, just the opposite. Student test scores have fallen to historic lows, as has college readiness. It should be obvious that the effects of new technology on so complex a process as human learning and neural development would be unknown at the outset. Yet there has been essentially no barrier, no boundary, and no time lag between the appearance of a new device in the consumer marketplace and the push to integrate this technology into classroom education. Obviously a crime, and one that actually is we're beginning to see in the courts. I want to conclude by dwelling a little further on the case of AI. Thus far, I've been emphasizing the importance of preserving the traditional practices and knowledges of the university from corruption by the wider culture. In the cases of job preparation and political engagement, I believe the separation of academic practices can be justified according to values widely recognized by the culture itself. People value experts when they stick to what they know. They value education that will give them genuine and lasting skills for living and working. Collapsing the boundary has clearly failed to deliver the socially desirable goods, but the case of AI shows how higher education can also foster countercultural values. In a striking reversal of the situation a quarter century ago when we faced the advent of the internet, public polling shows a significant majority of the American public views the advent of AI with suspicion and fear. And no one who's written about this or spoken about this topic, like I have, can fail to be deeply impressed by both the depth and breadth of negativity about AI right now. Yet the values underlying and explaining this fear await full articulation. Society requires a broad vision of the role of technology in national life that celebrates the dignity of the biological human and the value of the skills and traditions AI seeks to automate and replace. The dominant cultural politics of the past quarter century in many ways replicated the ethos of the tech world. Consider the calls for the disruption of tradition, the suspicion of the human, the celebration of identities made malleable through technology, and the animus against backward and oppressive gatekeepers. We stand in need of a new language for cherishing the human with all its flaws and limits, and a new means of seeing past millennia of human work as something more than a cesspool of slavery and domination. In what I regard as a hopeful sign, many on the academic left are now rethinking the culture's Manichaean view of tradition. Faced with the prospect of the evisceration of long-standing habits, skills, and culture by corporate robots, professors are reconsidering a wholly critical approach to the past. Assailed by a tidal wave of AI slop, they are learning a new appreciation for literary and musical classics of enduring value. Observing the rapacious, inhuman efficiency of the machine, they discern the value of traditional human skills and the sense of dignity and meaning with which they endow human lives. These values differ from the partisan political stances many in the academy adopted as a form of public engagement. An appreciation of human artifacts and of human traditions emerges organically from the nature of academic work. Hannah Arendt argued that education is necessarily conservative, not in a political sense, but simply in its orientation to the past as furnishing its material. She argued further that the effort of educators to determine the responses of new generations to current problems is misguided and represents a kind of tyranny of the old over the young. I just think this is a profoundly important point and sort of underemphasized in the secondary literature on Arendt. Here again, we need to observe and respect boundaries. Educators should supply a critical as well as an appreciative knowledge of the past and inculcate habits and practices of durable value. The application of that knowledge to new situations is the responsibility and privilege of new generations as they enter the world upon graduation. An academy oriented to its proper tasks is organically animated by a deep understanding of tradition and an appreciation for the human meanings of art, thought, and action. Today, these values are both profoundly countercultural and precisely what many in the culture long for. Here again, higher education's greatest value to society may depend on the boundaries that grant it relative autonomy from that society's reigning principles. Thank you.
Thank you. That gives me a ton to respond to. So first of all, I want to say thank you to the organizers here, to Heather, to Jeremy, to Lee, to everybody. And so far, I mean, I've changed everything that I want to say to respond to some of the great conversation that has happened already. So this is a vibrant and rich gathering already, even if I'm going to come out and say that, the state giveth and the state taketh away. And I know that these civic centers have been founded by the state, but the state is, I would say, the source of the greatest challenge that I see to education to come, which is the bureaucracy that is sort of underlying everything that we all do, at least in public higher education, and that this bureaucracy has served to make professors and faculty and faculty expertise less and less important than ever. That almost every state bureaucracy in the nation has policies that basically say, in terms of curriculum or courses, it does not matter who is teaching the course. And once you have a public policy that is so involved in the level of what a course is and who approves courses, then it means that it doesn't matter who is teaching the class. And I say that, I mean, it sounds like a silly thing, but it matters for state funding. So let me sort of walk you through some of these things in my conversation at 5 different points. And the first one is that professors are becoming less and less important. And I have if you haven't started following my Substack, do, Anecdotal Value, and my latest piece is about what I call the transfer industrial complex. 40%, almost 40% of students these days transfer from one institution to another. 40%. That is huge. The bureaucracy that requires that to happen is probably over $1 million per year per institution to have basically sticking a QR code on every course such that the learning outcomes transfer, that these are portable credits from one institution to the next, which means it does not matter who teaches the course. So I'm listening to these wonderful conversations about trying out new courses of engineering and civics, or co-teaching a class. And I sit there and as a former dean sitting there thinking, do you know what that costs? Like in dean circles, probably the nastiest word you could say is niche, right? Nobody wants a niche course. It doesn't transfer, right? Or you can't scale it up. You can't sell it to a legislature that says, how many people are going to be able to take this class? Can you take this class? And in the middle of a budget contraction, and in contraction, classes that are niche, classes that have local expertise, classes that could be taught by 2 people, are going to be the first to cut. Now, again, I love this idea. I think it's fantastic. But what I'll talk about is the underlying sort of state mechanisms that are the headwinds to any innovation that is niche and that is local. Civic centers will not be immune to this. And I've written about the fact that once civic centers have been sort of scaled up to teach gen ed at scale across the country, they will be subject to the same kind of pressures of homogeneity, transferability, portability, which means every class taught by in the civic center, it doesn't matter who teaches it. I mean, Harvey Mansfield comes to Florida, right? It doesn't matter if he's teaching a class, it will have to be portable, right? So what is the big deal about having a big name come to a program if the course can transfer and it doesn't matter? These things rarely get talked about in higher ed circles because they're boring, right? But California just passed a law a couple of years ago called Cal GETC, which means 2 years of the entire general education mandate across California, that it does not matter if you take it at the community college level, at the Cal State level, at the UC system. So when a friend of mine, a kid got into Merced, they got an email that said, you know, you can take your first 2 years of classes at the local community college. Now, is the quality of instruction the same at the community college as in the UC? Steve Mintz would say yes, because they're great. But I'm telling you, with anybody teaching a 5.5 low at a community college, it is not the same level of instruction. But you are correct in what will happen in the sort of divide in terms of the haves and have-nots. If you have a parent with means, or somebody who says, a parent that went to school said, no, go straight to the UC system. If you're first gen and you have strapped for cash, you will go to the community college. So what we see is a system that is benefiting the haves and the has-nots, and it's hidden under the idea of access. A couple of other things. How many of you know about the CIP SOC crosswalk? I love this. Oh, somebody back there. Okay, what this means is all, and you should all write this down. CIP, this is the sort of instructional program. This is the number that is attached to every, whether it's math or civics or English or farming or agriculture, you have a SIP code on the Department of Education, the Education Department, NECS, right? State of Florida, right, has a group of jobs that are high demand jobs in Florida. So there's a thing called, you've got two lists, a list of categories of study in the university, a list of jobs. And the funding mechanism is this crosswalk. We will fund these, like if you're going to be agricultural scientists, but then we expect those people to go into farming. And that is the funding model that funds University in Florida. So if you have somebody who perhaps wants to have an English degree, and I've written about this in a piece called Seeing Like a State University, because it is James C. Scott seeing like a state thinking on the part of legislatures, who want to get an English degree, but let's say their father has a plumbing business and want to go into plumbing. Right? This kind of thing, we want to have formations of citizens, we want to have them take classes in civics and engineering, all sorts of good things, and then why should we be measuring what they do and taking away funding for departments that are perhaps more supportive of formation of good moral citizens if they decide to go to be a plumber? Right? So you see these bureaucratic substrates that are working underneath what we're trying to do in terms of like the ideals, the Platonic ideal of what it is that civics or anything else is trying to do. A couple of other things I want to say in terms of curricular engineering. I mean, there's so many things, perhaps we can just do this in the Q&A. The idea of creating curriculum that will cross these boundaries is harder than you think. When I was at dean at Sonoma State University, I wanted to start a new major in film technology. And I had met Sam Altman at a dinner in 2019. I had early access to GPT-3 and DALL-E. And I said, okay, this is going to be the future. So what can I do within the Cal State system to create a new major of AI and film? Now, I managed to do this. It took me 3 years. But the bureaucratic, just the structure of like, who is this going to serve? Is it going to be minority serving? Like all of the various things, it gives you an inside look at the kinds of invisible, really truly invisible obstacles that are put up by states and systems to prevent innovation. And I say all this not to sort of bore or upset anybody, but for all the good things that everybody wants to do in civics or change institutions or reform institutions, they're not going to be, it's not going to be accomplished on the level of should. It's going to be accomplished at the level of how. And it's going to be accomplished, especially, I put the burden on civic centers that are mandated by states, to understand the power of the state to actually undo any good work that you want to do at the level of things like the crosswalk, at the level of state mandates, at the level of, at Utah, for example, there was just a mandate of course size, which means cutting any class that's under 10, which means any niche course taught by any expert is going to be gone. Now, I used to be able to solve this when I was a dean at the Cal State system by having averages, by saying, look, you want to have this small class, have a big class over there. You want to have small ensembles in music, we'll have a big 250-person class in history of rock and roll, and it'll average out to, however many person per class. But if the state legislature is not going to even allow that, then you're not going to have innovation. So I think I'll stop there and look forward to conversations about how the state giveth and the state taketh away, and how the state is actually the biggest challenge. State legislatures who are entering the arena in response to perceived political polarizations to try to right the ship, doing things like founding civic centers while leaving the problems intact that are actually standing in the way of innovation is a central challenge ahead. Thank you.
Well, would you each like to respond to the others' comments?
You want to go first, Hollis?
No, you go first.
Okay. I've long admired Hollis's thinking about bureaucratization, which is such a huge issue. I did want to, and we talked a little bit about this at dinner last night, Hollis, but I wanted to develop this question and thought, which is, yes, they'll say legislatures bring all kinds of problems, but at a civic center, it's democracy. You know what I mean? It's public money. It's how else do we allocate it in a democracy? Is there a better way? Probably not. So I would suggest I think the problem, if I'm hearing you right, is really a more basic problem about planning, about the limits of planning, and it's something I thought about also with the catastrophe that recent graduates of computer science are now facing, right? It's a problem of university or legislative bureaucracies attempting to predict job market trends at a time of incredible technological change. So what exactly? So can we pull apart? Because I'm not comfortable with just saying the state legislature, as a kind of block, because I don't really think and I don't want there to be an alternative to that democracy. But can we tease apart some of the commitments or presuppositions or assumptions that the state legislatures may be relying on that drive these, what I agree are really, bad outcomes?
Okay, I'm going to read something in response to, oh goodness, it just went away. What I consider ways that the legislature steps in. I don't know how many of you remember last summer, University of Oklahoma, there was a big dust-up where, this person had responded, a religious studies person had responded to a course prompt that said something about the Bible, and everybody was outraged that this was a political question. There was a mandatory class, I think it was a general education class in sociology, and, taught by an adjunct who was teaching multiple sections, and some young student responded, like, I believe in the Bible. Does everybody remember that big dust-up? Anyway, what was interesting to me is that the prompt, the canvas shell of the course being taught in an online asynchronous way with the You have to, by 11:59, put up 750 words on answering this prompt about this, and this is how we're going to grade you. If you have 701 words, you're going to already get 10% off. If you're going to have 659 words, you're going to have 20% off. If you have, I mean, if I have it on, I was going to read it, but the text is too small. The specificity of that class was soul-killing. Absolute soul killing. And I don't know if you've spent time looking at, had to do this all the time at Utah, the Utah system of higher education state mandates of what the learning outcomes and the processes that have to, the bureaucracy the boxes that you have to check to take a class, that by the time you get to the content of the class, you are so tired and exhausted. This is what I mean by state mandated, because the state wants everything to be legible, wants to be measurable, wants it to be transferable, all the metrics that we talk about, right? And so before you even get to the teacher and the student, the layers that need to be in place that manage that interaction are so dense. My view has been, I know you disagree, that it is faculty despair over this encroaching bureaucracy that leads them to be political, and to be political in one direction, fighting the man.
Yeah, I do totally disagree with that. The timeline is wrong for one thing. But what I'll say is just to. So my sense is that we can't think about this question. Like legislatures are not, these closed systems. They are highly responsive to voter feedback, right? Among other kinds of interest groups, but voter feedback for sure. And so one thing that I've noticed is the public. No one here disagrees that public trust in higher ed collapsed, right? Like in a totally unprecedented and shocking way. And the polls started showing that, I think around 22. There were some earlier ones, but anywhere between 2015, 2020, 21 is when you see that dramatic drop being reflected. And at that point, you have, I've talked with state legislatures who are highly involved in Ohio in reforming higher education, and I had lunch with one of these folks, and they basically said, look, my grandkids came home from OSU and would tell me what they were learning, and I was like, what the hell is this? And he said, I'm hearing from all of these constituents saying the same thing. This is just insane, right? And he would give examples, the kind of examples that I don't need to rehearse in this room. But the point is at that point, when the public has lost faith, and I think for very good reasons, in universities, there's limited tools, and they're all kind of bad tools. A lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them are bad tools. And one of them is micromanaging. One of them is, for example, if I can't trust the faculty to teach a certain course in a way that is actually showing both sides of arguments and so forth, then what I think I have to do as a legislator, is to mandate the actual text that you read. Now, that's not a great solution. It's not a solution I want to have, but you can completely see, and it's not any kind of internal problem to the black box of a legislature. It's coming directly from public opinion, which in turn is well-founded.
So, yes. And I mean, again, my experience in California in 2018, when Shirley Weber, an assemblywoman, passed the Shirley Weber bill, mandated ethnic studies curriculum through K through 12. It was going to start with the CSU system. It is now, Gavin Newsom paused it, but was going to also be at the community college and at the UC level. Mandated course. So anytime I hear mandated course, immediately I go to operationalizing. So because I was a dean, I was going to have to operationalize that. I had Black studies under me, Chicano studies, Native American studies, which meant suddenly we had to ramp up and have a mandated class with a state curriculum that perhaps gave us a little leeway. Now, one of the things that had happened, and I've written at this length over this, is that what is the definition of ethnic studies? Well, the definition of ethnic studies was expanded at UC Santa Cruz by the sort of faculty overseeing ethnic studies to include international indigeneity, even though the original bill was supposed to have just 4 ethnic groups. It was Chinese Americans, African Americans, Native Americans, and Chicano Americans, with a hell of a lot of focus on Cesar Chavez, I might add. And my faculty came to me and said, you know the problems with him, but we can't say anything out loud. It was really crazy. But when after UC San Diego expanded the definition to have any indigenous population fighting against the man, that meant by law, under any kind of academic freedom, Palestine became an acceptable studies in the California Ethnic Studies mandate. And like at that point in time, I was out of there because there was just no way I would have to defend the academic freedom in an ethnic studies course. And we see, I mean, everything that happened in response to October 7th in California had a great deal to do with that definition of ethnic studies. This is how bureaucracy works. And this is why when the state gets involved, I get suspicious. Because you don't know what's going to happen when somebody has access to definitions that are going to change a curriculum.
Maybe and then we can maybe have some questions from the audience. But I think I totally see. I'm a fan of Scott's, of a lot of Scott's work. I think it's very important. It's very illuminating. But I think I'm resistant to that as an entirely self-contained explanatory model when it's not looking at the broader cultural trends. Because again, for all their flaws, state legislatures really are responsive to constituent concerns and so act as a kind of, and when you see those polls and you see the public opinion changing, that's when you really see a lot of this action on state, within a year, you see these various initiatives get starting. So I don't know that it's enough to simply talk about the many very serious bureaucratic problems without talking about the major cultural forces that are the elephant in the room in almost every one of these conversations.
Can I, before I hand it over, I'm going to use moderator's prerogative here, and I'm going to ask you both to speak about the other half of the question, which is solutions. I think you can disagree about the source of the problems, but what are the solutions to the respective problems that you've identified? Either bureaucracy or, Michael, what I understood you to be saying, the overly porous borders of this. So yeah.
Well, I'll jump in first. I mean, I think I'm an AI accelerant or accelerationist or whatever the term is. I think AI has shown light on the problems that I have seen happening for years. Gives us the opportunity to rethink what it is that the university is for in a moment of what I call information abundance. And I've written about, general education I think needs to go away. It is a bundle of known knowns, to use the Donald Rumsfeld formulation, and that we should, as quickly as possible, have 2 purposes for universities, which is moral and ethical formation, but also delivery of knowledge at the frontier. You ended your remarks saying something about faculty being able to stay in their lane and stick to what they know. I would say probably, from my perspective as a dean, 30% of faculty currently teaching right now are teaching out of their area of expertise. It could be as high as 60%. Okay, no business runs this sloppily, right? So what AI would, if I could snap my fingers and make general education go away across the country, I would do so. I would have it delivered by AI in some format, and that what education would be is students studying with subject matter experts in a field at the frontier of knowledge. That is the only way we're going to stay competitive in the world.
Yeah, so I also I think differently, but like Hollis, have seen AI really bringing to the fore issues that I've thought about, many of us have thought about for a long time. And in particular, I think it has actually made, I'm among those who believe that it's made the case for traditional humanistic education infinitely stronger than it was 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I'm seeing that, not just from people like myself, but, when I hear from people, like I do public, write for the Atlantic or whatever, I come into contact with a bunch of different people, business groups. That's what they're telling me, which is we no longer, a lot of these vocational skills we can automate. judgment, reflective judgment, the capacity to synthesize knowledge, human communication. These are the kinds of skills, the ability to ask a good question, right? You know what I mean? To name the main major interface with AI. These are the skills that are in demand, are increasingly in demand, and these are precisely the skills that a traditional liberal arts education gives you. And what's needed for that are strong walls to shelter that space from a culture that is profoundly hostile to those skills in every way, whether it's intention, whether it's the degradation of attention. You know, we go on and on. I think that shelter, and as I said, the greatest social good that universities can provide can only come at the cost of being as different as possible from the host culture.
All right, thank you. We'll open it up for questions. We'll start here in the back, yeah.
Thanks so much. I think this is ultimately a question about some of the boundaries issues and picks up this theme about sort of vocational or professional training. You use terms like jobs and work. I was just wondering if you'd say a little bit more about that space. Insofar as I was thinking about sort of what it means to be a civic center, I would think about the choice of careers as, I mean, sort of calls this the hardest problem in the world. It's a reflection of my values. It is a question of the culture in which I find myself. It's a longitudinal project. And so I do think that it'd be helpful to hear more about how civic centers and how you think we should be engaging students with regard to careers, rather than, for example, holding our noses and talking about jobs and work as things of, not a reasonable scope of topic for humanistic education.
I have a quick answer to that, which is I think that the jobs question is irrelevant. I think the idea that universities should care about what you do after the university is nonsense. I understand that as a radical opinion. But I think if you are a consumer, you can go to college for your purposes. I don't think your purposes are my business.
Yeah, I mean, I would put it a little bit differently, but it's such an important question. It's such an important question, and regardless of how one feels about our, training people for jobs, the fact is students and parents are extremely anxious at this moment because we're at a moment, and university administrators are completely freaking out, right? Witness the Ohio State's AI initiative, just a complete expression of this collapse of a model that seemed to work pretty well for 10 to 20 years. So what is that model? That model is take this major, you get a good paying job. That is exactly the model. That model is completely collapsed right now. AI, I can't tell you the extent to which when you talk to actual business people and executives, for 10 minutes, the idea that you can take a major and have a solid job that could last more than a year, completely nonsense. So in that extent, I think Hollis is totally right. However, I absolutely do not think we can say to students, don't worry about the job. What are you talking about? You know what I mean? Like, I'm a first generation college student, an immigrant. I did not have money to go to college. You know what I'm saying? Like, my dad was not about to so you need to give them that answer. And here is where I actually think the development of AI presents a great opportunity for us, which is these skills that traditionally, so it used to be either or, either skills to get a great job right away or liberal arts education. I think we're now at a moment when that either or has collapsed, and now the skills that are increasingly in demand in the workplace are precisely the skills that the liberal arts create. However, as Stephen Mintz has written about really brilliantly, disagree with some of his conclusions, but really agree with his diagnosis of the problem. Making that case previously that liberal arts skills will give you good career outcomes, we've done a terrible job of making that case. And so I think we do need to innovate. I think that one example would be, as I sort of said, was 3 years of coursework and then a year with projects that are integrated towards field-specific or career-specific kinds of outcomes. That's one model. The better model would be my grandfather, when he graduated from college, on my American side, got a job at a bank, and they actually trained him on the job how to do his job. companies have offloaded that to universities for decades now. I think that if that came back, that would be a really wonderful thing for everyone. I don't know that we can count on that, but that's so some of my response. Really good question.
Daniel.
Thank you for this. My question's for Hollis. I feel you on the bureaucracy. I'm a new hire at the Chase Center, and as a religion historian, my joke is I have read medieval canon law that is clearer than some of the bureaucracy at OSU, but we're working it out. A question I previously was at the Ashbrook Center, and something, as someone who walks in many of these Civics Center circles, is many of the older but smaller civic centers are freaking out because we do not have the millions of dollars and the state support that these other state schools at Florida, UNC, OSU. I'm curious, after listening to you speak, would potentially their ability to be nimble and not deal with, I mean, they're universities, they have bloat, but still, like, do they have an advantage perhaps at the small, or even the University of Austin as a new enterprise, or Hillsdale as a like, I'm curious about your thoughts about the other non-state supported civic centers.
I think, I mean, I haven't looked into it, but I think absolutely, whoever pays you, you're going to have to do what they're paying you to do. Now, I would say that my history from Black Studies is looking at the formation of a brand new discipline from 1968 onward to the fact that Black Studies programs are in every university in the country now in some way or another. My participation in that should not be seen as a political project one way or the other, except to say that I understand the way that new projects and new centers have to operate within traditional disciplines. And the fact that I have watched and looked at the history of Black Studies programs turning into ethnic studies programs, migrating into this, sharing space with gender studies programs, like having all sorts of pressures that are, make them particularly precarious. I think the small, nimble, keep to your mission, stick to your knitting sort of programs without that sort of bureaucratic mandate will do better.
Thank you. I find this absolutely fascinating. I am a former state legislator who now is a higher ed leader. So hearing your beginning discussion has really been remarkable. And I'm doing this here in Ohio. So the tension has been from the beginning, where the universities have been and where the legislature has been. And about 20 years ago, I had a former gubernatorial chief of staff who told me higher ed was off limits. We don't play in that area. We give them the money that they're asking for, and that's part of the budget that we just don't question. That's obviously radically changed. So I'd like to go back to hear a little bit more about your solutions because, in Ohio, post Senate Bill 1, we've been dealing with a lot and trying to get, presidents who are used to, the world where you don't touch higher ed, to legislators who are not going to let up on this. We've lived through Senate Bill 1. We're going to get more legislative changes. I agree with you 100% about the bureaucracy and the burden that causes, but it's not going away. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about your suggestions for solutions.
Well, first of all, I wish there were more people like you who would be asking that question, right? And I think about, since you brought up the religious studies, I think a lot about the Catholic principle of subsidiarity, which is always try to solve problems at the lowest possible level, right, on the ground. And one of the issues that I've seen as a dean and thinking about the lack of trust in public education or higher education is administrators just not having the courage to do the right thing, which is taking problematic faculty out of the classroom, which is ensuring that there's high quality teaching, which is the administrators that actually have power. And having been a dean, I tried to exercise my power to the extent I could to take people out of the classrooms, to allow people to take leaves and take research leads, to do things like innovate and have co-taught classes, all the things. I read every single course evaluation of and I really did address problematic teaching. And till I did, but it was shocking to me to realize that 90% of fellow deans around the country, I'd go to dean meetings like this, and we'd all be deans, and I'd say, like, how many of you spend a week reading course evaluations? And no hands would go up. None, right? So there are deep problems. They're just not where everybody is putting the solutions. And part of the reason after stepping down, I've been hammering some of these bureaucratic things in my Substack is because nobody else is talking about them.
Yeah, I just say something really quick in follow-up. I think, the question is, why haven't administrators done anything meaningful before this absolute mess? And one reason is the administrators are terrible. I was just at a well-regarded East Coast university giving a talk, and the provost introduced it, and she said, here at X university, we give students transformative experiences, including experiential experiences. And I was like, what? Yeah, it's the first thing to think is to do a close reading of that inanity, right? The first thing one wants to say is, like, the collapse I was talking about is all in that language, right? Administrators are uncomfortable with using the word education. How many times have you heard the word experience as a euphemism for education? That's insane. You know what I'm saying? Like experiential experiences. What's going on in our head is the idea that we've already collapsed the boundary between work and education, and so that's just an experience. And now we're going to signal that it's now no longer in the classroom, so that's an experiential experience. You know what I mean? And so that kind of thinking, it was exposed in the House hearings a couple of years ago. I think we need new and better administrators is one way of thinking about it.
Jeremy.
Yeah, so that gets nicely at sort of the question I had wanted to raise, which is I think a common theme running through several of the discussions is how do we define the unique value added of a university education? And so the language about experience is actually one attempt to do that, right? It's to try to say, come here because you're going to get the experience, not just the education, because that could be transferable, which is the danger, right? But my question from that then is, how do we want to define the value of a college education? It seems to me you both might be saying expertise, like if we could define it as expertise. So then the next question would be, how do we make that legible? Like if you're both saying that, and feel free to correct me, that expertise is what we would use, faculty expertise is what we would use to say, this is why you should come here, but we have to then make that legible to people as they should accept that and want to support it. So tell me if I'm off track or if there's a way to do that.
I think you're absolutely on track. And this question of legibility, just like I get that it needs to be measurable, but if you are actually at the edge of a field, right? Like, my son is an engineer and he's in the private sector and he's thinking of going back to a PhD program, whatever, someplace to work on materials, right? The edges of materials where you can sort of 3D print one atom at a time, like really fascinating stuff for building bridges, all sorts of things, right? And there's an undergraduate component always. Who's to know why, to make that legible to a legislature, takes labor, right? The labor of making things legible is exactly what I'm thinking is what we need to fight against, right? Because, for every one scientist doing really cool things, you've got like 10 people trying to make it legible to parents and legislatures. Now, I get that would and should take trust, right? And so the loss of trust that Michael's talking about is exactly the problem. And again, I don't know how to get that trust back, but expertise at the frontier means you don't know what it's going to be useful for, right? And you asked a good question at dinner last night. What is the edge of civics? What is a really interesting civics scholarship that is cutting edge? What does that actually look like, right? Those questions should be asked more than the making them legible.
Yeah, really interested in what Hollis said. It's a wonderful question, Jeremy. I would never use the word expertise to defend the value of what we do to anyone. And let me say what I do think. I wouldn't go in that direction I would go in the direction of things like freedom, like liberal arts, have a free life. You know what I mean? Do you want to have a free life? The value of the human, the value of tradition. Now, these are values, and this is a language that higher education has forgotten how to speak. And it has happened at the same, and as much as I admire Hollis's work, the language you just used, Hollis, is the language of the tech industry. It's the language of our culture. The values that a higher education should inculcate, there's nothing new about them. It's the values of the liberal arts. But it is, they now have a countercultural kind of ethos. And so that's what you're saying to people. And here's the thing that's really fascinating. People are now receptive. Just in the last few years, I've noticed a real sea change in, and I think a lot of it has to do with AI and with how technology has unfolded over the last quarter century. When you talk to people, so I write fiction. I hear from a lot of readers who say basically, I love reading. I'm not a professor or anything like that. I wish I had taken English or literature or something in college. My job makes me feel like a cog in the machine. Everything I hear on social media makes me want to blow my brains out. And of course, many people are, tragically, right? But that's the reality, you know what I'm saying? And so freedom, valuing the human, all of the things that we inculcate, and we are a countercultural space to make that happen, I think that's real. And I don't think we need any longer to sort of continue to try to fit that into the language of corporate tech speak. Because I think people now are sick to death of corporate tech speak. You know what I'm saying? I don't think it sells anything. That's my
Well, I want to add, though, because even if we're talking about inculcating values in the classroom, right, who are the, I'm going to use the word, who are the experts at doing that? Because right now, I think it matters who is in the classroom. And I think it matters so much in the age of AI. You know, if value added means a faculty member cannot say, I can deliver this beyond what AI can do. And AI, I think, could probably pretty good at inculcating values. You may disagree with that. But what is it that a human faculty member can do? And can you articulate what you can do better than AI? I think that should be the standard of faculty in higher education.
First of all, I completely agree with you, Hollis, I didn't mean to say I don't believe in expertise. Completely written books about it. I totally agree on expertise. What I did want to say, though, is you threw me off with your AI can inculcate human values. Part of it, I think, really is it's not just that humans can do it better than AI, which is one question. Increasingly, I think it's the question of what, as a society or as educators, do we want humans to do? What kind of judgments should be and should remain human judgments, regardless of efficiency measures? That's a sort of a separate question, if that makes sense.
I know you want one more
I think
question.
we have time for one more question. And right here,
So I'm trying to use AI to read Hannah Arendt quickly to discuss the close reading that you're using. And while we agree on a lot, I guess one thing that concerns me about the humanities is we have these figures that we invoke, and who is going to argue with Hannah Arendt? Like, I'm immediately frightened to suggest that Hannah Arendt might be wrong. But I wonder if her notions, I mean, first of all, I'm not sure that, I need to spend more time with Hannah Arendt. I'm not sure that our close readings would agree. But I also wonder whether some of our figures have caught up with our present time, and whether your notion of freedom, which is based on these previous figures, applies today when technology drives so much of our world. And having that kind of wall really concerns me. So I guess you and I will discuss Hannah Arendt later, but just that kind of invocation of our greats that often stops conversation because one is worried about, right, asking whether that's relevant for today. I guess I would be curious.
I mean, yeah, Kate, that is a really wonderful question, and you know, the tradition offers us amazing riches and resources for asking these questions, but as Arendt said, it doesn't dictate how we apply that to our current situations. That's one thing I would say. I you know, have lots of disagreements with Hannah Arendt, you know what I mean? But which I'm not afraid to, and I encourage my students to be active readers and to be critical. In terms of the wall, I should stop there, because we're running out of time. We can talk more about it later.
Oh, yeah, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just wanted to say one thing. I think about the Hannah Arendt that I teach most often now is her reflections on Little Rock, right? Her great piece that she then recanted, that why should we put the burden of social change on high school students? And I think it's an interesting question, right? Because even now with AI in schools, it is as if we, or civics or what have you, we're putting the burden on students that maybe grown-ups should be solving.
All right, well, thank you all very much for a very stimulating conversation.